Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to Rethink Culture, the podcast that shines a spotlight on business leaders who are rethinking workplace culture. My name is Andreas Constantinou, and I'm your host, and I'm an entrepreneur with a passion for reinventing culture. With me today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Will Scott. So Will is many things. He's an entrepreneur, he's a published author, he's a servant leader, a father, a triathlete, and an international citizen. So let me tell you a bit about Will before he introduces himself. So as an entrepreneur, he grew 2 software companies before founding his current business, the Culture Fix Academy, which is a collective of culture coaches. He is sought after for his Culture Fix, which is a process. It's a process over 9 deeds, as he calls them, in 90 days for helping companies reinvent their core values and culture. He also published a lot of his thoughts and experiences about culture fixing in the book with the same name, Culture Fix. He's also spending a lot of time as a servant leader. He's the current president and founding member of EO, that's Entrepreneurs Organization in Wisconsin. And he's also an accelerator trainer and chair. He's a proud father of Sam and Chloe. And born in Zambia, lived in 6 countries, very international, based in the US in the last few years. And he's graciously woken up very early today at 6 a.m., where Will's based. And he's also an athlete and complete several triathlons a year. So hats off. Please welcome Will Scott.
Wow, thank you, Andreas. That's quite the introduction.
So welcome to the podcast.
Let's build up some high expectations there.
Really looking forward to this.
Yeah.
So tell us about yourself and like how you started out maybe in life as a child and the experiences that led you to work on this topic of culture with a capital C.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for that invitation to sort of talk about how a story that I like to tell from when I was 10 years old that links right up to the work that I'm doing today, 6 decades later. Well, 5 decades later, I suppose. But yes, as you said, I was born and raised in Zambia. And one of the things I used to love doing as a boy was building clubhouses, all kinds of clubhouses, especially tree houses. And something would make me hesitate, Andreas, before I invited friends into my tree house. It was so important to me. I'd lovingly built the place, and I really cared about the experience that people were going to have there. And so what I would do is I would put up some rules on the side of the treehouse. Rules like, be nice to each other. And my thinking there, my little sort of 10-year-old self was, I had these little fears that, what if people don't have a good time in the treehouse, or they don't want to come back, or they spoil, the feeling in the treehouse by being mean to each other. And that's why I put rules up, you see. And I realized when I started doing this work some decades later, when I'm helping companies put core values on their walls, but importantly, making sure those values are not just empty words on the wall, but they are alive and thriving in the hearts and minds of the population in that organization, such that they can use them and use the power of values to create the environment that they want and to lead from a place where the behaviors are such that positive outcomes happen and people feel safe, they feel creative, and they feel their best selves, and they can really live, a holistic life of joy and meaning. And so taking that sort of theory back to the treehouse, if ever my friends were, arguing or fighting, and I can remember one very specific time when Stuart and Daigoro were actually arguing about who should light the fire. I just said, hey, guys, remember, we all agreed, and then point to the words on the wall, to be nice to each other. and they would just say, "Oh yeah, sorry, Will, rules of the clubhouse." They just got it. I wasn't being bossy or an asshole. It was just the rules, and it worked. It helped us maintain a nice environment for everybody. And I think this is so underutilized today, Andreas, in the workplace. And this is where I realize my work comes from. I know most companies by now have figured out they need to have core values. Very few of them have a valued culture. And that's why with the Culture Fix, we're about going from simply having core values to truly having a valued culture. And we've figured out there's some things that you can do to make sure that when you have values, they are actually alive and thriving and being used. It's a very, very low investment for the business leaders, and yet there's a massively high return. And we see this all the time. We measure it. We measure before and after, and we see these big, 30-point plus improvements in the culture. It's a long answer, Andreas, but thank you. It kind of tees up our conversation around, what we're talking about today.
So how did you go from like the vision of that communal, feel-good, respectful behavior in the treehouse to like the journey of founding two software companies and then choosing to focus on culture? So how was that journey for you?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a bit like it happened naturally for me in the treehouse. I think I'm naturally a people person, and I naturally cared about how people felt, and how often these values, Andreas, are voids. They're voids that we have inside us that are so deep that we can't get enough of them. That's why we value it, right? It's kind of an antithesis of what you might think. But so clearly I had voids where it was, which were come from experiences in my upbringing, you see, that mean I cared about how people feel in organizations that I'm leading. And, funny thing, I remember in my 30s realizing that, my mission is to create environments where people thrive. And funnily enough, Simon Sinek, actually, in a conversation with him, helped me finish that statement. Because I said, "Hey, Simon, I like to create environments where people thrive." And of course, he said, "Why?" The why guy said, "Why?" And I was able to immediately respond with, "Oh, yeah, so they can be the best that they can be." And so, I think, a lot of us are striving to find our purpose. And luckily for me, some events in my life have helped me, understand my purpose, understand my, my gift to the world. And so here I am doing this joyful, noble work of helping organizations with their culture and changing the environment and the lives for so many people. And it's naturally, who I am. So you mentioned the software companies. I'm not technical myself. I don't write code, but I was really more the process person. I would solve business problems with processes, and then my team would sort of enable that with code that led to technical solutions. And so that really meant that my focus as a leader was on the people side of the business.
That's unusual actually, because most founders are like the engineers or the technical
Yeah.
experts, whether it's the cooks or the carpenters or what have you. But you are the
Yes.
people person who started the business, right?
Yes. Well, so I should say that in the case of the supply chain software company, I started that together with my brother and another chap who was he was the software guru behind it all. And in the case of the mobile app development company, I actually bought into a company that had been started by a technical visionary. And if you know the sort of EOS speaker, visionary and integrator, when I bought into that company, I took the integrator role, and together, and he was brilliant when it came to technical solutions and to code. And together we did create rocket fuel. We grew the company very quickly. And it had actually been on a slow decline when I joined Alex at that company. But together, and once I brought my focus on culture, we quickly turned and we grew very quickly for the next 6 years
I
until I
see.
exited that company. Yeah,
So moving to like where you're today with Culture Fix, I understand it's like I think you called it a coaching system where you coach the coaches,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And
Well,
what
so what?
like go ahead.
So Andreas, that began because once I exited the mobile app company in 2016, friends who had seen what I'd been doing with culture at my company, and that's what I was sort of more passionately writing blogs about and talking about. They asked, "Hey, Will, could you come and help me with my culture?" Do you know, there's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business leaders don't like the way it feels in their own company after a few years, usually because of some of the people they hired. And so I would get, after I got a number of requests to help people. And that's when I realized, oh, yeah, uh, people have values. They don't have a valued culture. In fact, my research has shown that less than half of all employees can name less than half the values. And therefore, the values have very little value, right? If you do the math on that. So there's a huge opportunity there. And that's when I decided, okay, I believe there is a system here. There's a framework. And so I wrote the 9 Deeds in 90 Days, Bring Your Culture Alive, Make It Thrive, and Use It to Drive Performance, with all the things that are aspects that are in the Culture Fix book. And now my second book, The Gift of Culture. And so I was consulting myself. And then after a while, I thought, there's something that's working here. And I would like to get this out to a greater, proportion of the world and grow this more quickly. And that's when I adopted the methodology of having coaches become members of the Culture Fix Academy so they could then take the Culture Fix to their clients. And very quickly, got to 25 coaches actually, Andreas, now in 12 months. And there's a common thing. Coaches are doing this great work going into usually, SMEs, small and medium enterprises. And they've got solutions or tools that they're bringing. But there aren't a lot of codified, frameworked culture solutions. So they love it. And I call it a collective of culture coaches. And we meet every week on Zoom and share best practice. And now, they are taking it to their organizations. And it's a very exciting time for me and my business to see this starting to happen. I had no idea, that there was this need in the world.
Do you find that values is the domain of HR or of CEOs? Like, what's your experience and how do you feel it should be? Like, whose concern is it?
Thank you. So I do believe that our work at the Culture Fix is actually helping leaders to lead with values. We're just using this term culture that people sort of understand to get there. But you're leading with values is very important that is coming from the leaders of the company. And so we have an enormous amount of work to do on that side without actually getting into HR. So the Culture Fix, we don't really do HR. We don't write handbooks and that sort of thing. We are about, first of all, bringing a cultural definition for that organization. And even if they've got core values, sometimes they didn't come about it in a very, discerning and native way that really taps the DNA of the organization. So we're very intentional about uncovering with surveys and interviews, not just of the employees, by the way, Andreas, but all the stakeholders. Because I believe that leaders, CEOs and company leaders, they're not just leading a company, they're leading a culture, which is a far more grandiose and bigger and more responsibility too. When our employees go home, those values spread to everyone they're touching. What about our vendors upstream and our customers downstream, our shareholders, you know, our investors? If we can lead with values across all of those different stakeholders, magic happens. And I'm excited to be getting into a project. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about it today, but in a non-corporate setting, a school district, a rural school district in Indiana, Andreas, through one of my coaches who is active in that geography and in the school system, has asked for help. And education, can really use this. So I'm going to be working with not just the teachers, which was the obvious thing for the superintendent. I'm going to involve the children at that school, the parents, and the board of directors. You see, it's a community thing. And
Fascinating.
together we're going to establish values, which I believe, and then train them how to lead with those values. And I believe that's going to make a very big difference for the challenges that education faces today. Teachers are burned out post-COVID. Some of the behaviors in the schools are very disrespectful and challenging. And so I'm looking forward to making a difference there.
That could very well be a pioneering project.
Yeah.
I was thinking of something else you mentioned, investors. Like there are some cases where companies have been vilified for their culture, like WeWork or like what was the other one? Uber, of course. Do you find investors care for like the companies they invest in and what values they uphold, or they just
Well, yeah.
buy into them and find out?
So I think your question is almost leading, isn't it? It's almost insinuating probably the real situation, which is that investors are known for not caring about the environment and the way people feel in the company, and really just caring about, of course, the shareholder value that's created and the growth rate. And but I believe that is absolutely changing, Andreas. And if it isn't changing now, I can confidently predict that in the future, this is going to increasingly matter more and more. And I think it's already happening today. And there's some beautiful examples, like the founder of Patagonia and what he just did recently. Where do people want to work? Where do the millennials and the Gen Zs want to work? They want to work in companies that do care about the purpose and meaning of the company. They do want to work for companies that are not harming the planet. And I think enlightened board members, and even where investors are invested in a company, if they trust the CEO and the CEO is caring about those things, the sorts of things that conscious capitalism teaches, then actually what happens in consciously capital, is that a thing? Companies, what you see is not only a great place to work that is caring, but also very high financial performance, actually even higher than companies that are simply focused on profits and growth. So it's coming, and the leaders that are going to benefit from this and the investors are going to benefit eventually will be ones that care.
It's a very interesting topic of discussion.
Yeah.
We, of course, have heard of culture eat strategy for breakfast, and we know that if employees are disengaged, disincentivized, slacking, or just not there, your business is not going to be efficient. But I personally think it's not just a question of performance. I think it's more if you enjoy what you do, it's gonna look like work to others, but it's gonna look like fun to you. And you're going to be putting much more of your potential in your work, and you are going to be reverberating that positivity and shining as a result of finding fulfillment as an employee. So there's a lot of intangibles there. And I don't know if the tools we have today, and I'm just thinking out loud here, like Glassdoor or similar sites, I don't know if like there is enough transparency and visibility and awareness into the culture of companies in the same way there is visibility into the financial performance of public companies.
Yeah.
And there is obviously visibility into this company raising X and that company raising Y and that company going public. So there is plenty of visibility on performance. But when we look at, which company should be out there and which leaders should be showcased and elevated in the public eye for running these amazing cultures where people feel empowered and engaged and so on, I don't know if there's enough of that transparency and awareness. I don't know what your thoughts are.
No, I completely agree with that. I dream, Andreas, one day of, a bit, I don't know if you know JD Power and how they
Yeah.
rate companies on quality.
Yeah.
I would love one day to have a system that rates companies on their culture. And how do you do that? Well, one way is you would rate them on, do they act in concert with their stated values? And so
Mm.
many companies do not. One of my favorite games to play, Andreas, is whenever I hear a corporate scandal, is, I wonder what their core values are. And I almost know before I go there what their core values are going to say. And there's so many examples of this. I've written blogs about, you mentioned Uber, Wells Fargo, Boeing, all kinds of examples of companies. Those are sort of negative stories, but they're also very positive stories I've written about in terms of McDonald's and Starbucks, where these companies, clearly the values they chose to put on the walls and their mission and purpose were ideals that they, by their operations, just stomp all over. And employees, however great a job we do as leaders of describing the culture and leading with that, employees will follow the two things that are natural to humans, and that is the examples that are set by the leaders and the incentives that are in place. So part of having a great culture is to have leaders that absolutely walk the talk of the stated values of the company, and their incentives in place encourage compliance with those values. And so there's so many examples. And I think one way to change that, Andreas, to change the challenge that you just posed, is for leaders to be not only very transparent with their finances, but to be transparent with themselves. How do leaders do that? Of course, it's through being vulnerable. If they are willing to be vulnerable and willing to listen to their employees, for example, I always like to do a survey. And so I find some CEOs don't want to do the survey because they actually are afraid to hear what the employees are going to say about their organization. That's ludicrous, isn't it? But leaders that are really willing to listen, that are willing to show their weaknesses, their mistakes, to be vulnerable, those are cultures which empower everybody to feel safe and to be their best, bring their best selves to the workplace, and not really have this work and home life, but just one life. So yes, thank you for that question. And there are ways to do that. And again, the best leaders are absolutely transparent about the culture as they are transparent about the finances. And when something happens, they immediately, are open about that issue too. And of course, that's better rather than trying to hide issues, to be open and come out with press statements and all that sort of thing, and be willing to stand behind a microphone. And something that I think leaders misses. A lot of leaders are still trying to hide behind stuff, but I think they're stressed and they're tense and they're not sleeping well at night. The most peaceful place for a leader to be is to have stated values which really say, this is who I am, and then can stand in the spotlight of those values. I think that's a really peaceful place to be, and it's great for all the people around you.
I'm gonna put that on the poster. I very much like your quote. I'm gonna quote you. So Will,
Please, yeah.
in the case of values, right? I mean, you mentioned earlier about companies not standing up to their values. The name of Enron came to my mind, whose value was
Yeah,
integrity, right, of all companies.
yeah, yes,
And I've always struggled in my business. Um, how do you bring these values to life? Like in my business, in Slash Data, we created a set of behaviors next to each value. So we have 7 values and a set of behaviors. So what does like transparency mean? It means like we run postmortems. It means that we are uh, open about all the information, sales costs, whatever, except for salaries, and everything is public. So we give out examples of behaviors for each of the values. How do you work with your clients when you want to bring these values to life so that they are then internalized, metabolized, adopted
yeah,
by the staff?
yes. Well, one of the most important things that we have found there is to have a notice and nominate scheme where one member of the population, one employee, can nominate another employee when they saw them committing a core value. And then have them at your weekly town hall, and hopefully companies are meeting kind of weekly now, not monthly, because 12 touches a year is not enough, I don't think. If you really want to instill values in people, you need to have 52
Totally
or at least
agree.
50 touches a year, right? And so a notice and nominate scheme, and then at that town hall, you ask Fred to tell the story about how they caught Mary committing a core value and what that meant and how it made them feel. That story is what people will remember. And that is a great example and memorializes that value. And people go, oh, that's what that value looks like. So that's on the sort of that's the easy one, the notice and nominate, where we give a shout out, right? But then I also encourage in sort of culture 2.0, more mature cultures, is to step into catch and correct that we teach, where we're actually catching and correcting when somebody's not behaving in alignment with the value. So I love what you did at your company, Andreas, where you had values and then you had descriptive behaviors that helped them know, what do we mean by that value here? But then there's notice and nominate and catch and correct. And the catch and correct takes some skill. But that sort of comes at the end of our culture fix process. And that's why it's so important to get at the beginning of the process, is to get the words right. Because we're all about providing a language that employees can use easily to catch and correct, just like I did in my treehouse. Hey, everybody, remember, we all agreed to be nice to each other. Oh, yeah, sorry. Um, and what's beautiful about that is, Andreas, if I challenge you, that can look like a conflict between me and you. But if I call both of us to a higher standard, to like a compass, a true north, and I like to believe there's a poster on the wall for this, then it's a much more of a, oh yeah, that's right. That's our code of conduct. Those are our values. And so it's really important that we help people have that, because the example I like to give is, let's say I'm in a meeting, I have an idea, and somebody, the kind of bully in the room, sort of shuts down my idea or makes me feel dumb or stupid for that. And if we've got a value of, we listen to understand, or, teamwork or something, then I want to feel empowered. Even if I'm an introvert and it's hard for me, I want to be able to say to that person after the meeting, hey, can I just take you aside and just talk to you and do this by the poster and say, listen, one of our values is this. And the way you just made me feel in there didn't feel like that was in concert with that. And if I don't say something to you, there's a danger that I'm not going to bring my ideas next time because you're just going to shut me down. And that's not a value that we have here. So isn't that fantastic, Andreas? If I can do that without going to my boss, most companies, I got to go to my boss and complain. And they go to their boss and complain. And we have this chain of complaints going around instead of just two humans addressing a difficult conversation. with the values. And this is what I mean about people have values, but they are not using them in that way. Most of them don't even know the company's values.
So how do you, like, if you have a value that's not self-explanatory, you have teamwork, or if you have something like do what's right,
Yeah.
how do you add color to that so that the staff can have a mutually agreed understanding, like a completely intuitive understanding of what the value means, what behaviors are allowed and what behaviors are not, according to that value?
Well, so in your example there of do the right thing, it is do the right thing is great, but of course we can go a step further with that with, let's say, 3 bullets underneath do the right thing, or with descriptive behaviors that say what we mean by that. That's one thing that helps. Now we've already embellished or given more context to the value with those descriptive behaviors. But then if we start having notice and nominate schemes where we're telling the stories about when that value happens, and we capture all of those, before long we've got, in the annals of our history now, we've got all these stories that talk about and that exemplify what we mean by that, and they're happening live in our town halls and being talked about all the time. That's a great way to create a culture, which, this is not all science. I mean, as you talked about, I like to say that strategy is to thought as culture is to feelings. And if we're all strategy and thought in a business, then we're ignoring what it is to be human. And so humans communicate with words, and words are really important. And then use stories to codify those words, those values that are coming through there. And there's one other thing that I'd like to make on this. It's not just about one value. You said you have 7, Andreas. So it's about the way the values work together. So when you build up this picture, here's a value, here's the descriptive behaviors, here's the other values and the other descriptive behaviors, here's the stories that support all of that. And before long, you've got a culture which everybody, gets and feels and understands, and we can measure them. There are also ways, we have something called the core score, Andreas, to measure the way employees and associates align with the values, and then we can give them feedback on that based on those values, and give them real examples from stories where we saw them either behaving in concert or in opposition to the values. So do all these things, and these are all in the culture fix, and then we really can codify culture and have it such that the members love where they work, they love who they work with, and they have purpose and meaning to their work, which we haven't really talked about yet. But when you combine, when you have the values that help people enjoy the present today, and then you have a purpose that is something exciting about the difference we make for the world, the goodness we do for the world that's in the future, then I think there's some magic there too for a culture.
So as people build this heritage or legacy of culture within their business by, did you call it naming, and I think you called it citing,
Notice
or
and nominate.
yes,
Notice and
notice and
nominate.
nominate.
Yep.
So you have a body of culture that's building up. To me, that sounds like the culture is itself an organism. It's living. And as I'm guessing, new people come in, their perception of culture might be changing or might be slightly different. So this is like a growing body of stories of what culture is like, which to me reminds me that values is not what some people think it's set in stone. You like define the values and they're there forever. But like Amazon does, where they review their culture or their values annually, I think you've captured it perfectly. That in my mind, this is like a living organism of values, or which the values itself are living. Does that need at some point to be checked or aligned or
Yeah,
realigned in some way?
I love it. And the answer is of course, Andres, is yes. Now, pick a time frame, but I'd like to think that values are not reviewed every year, just in my opinion. Every 3 to 5 years, perhaps, yes. But there are certainly times when it's a good time to refresh or revisit the values. And I've actually done this in my own career. At one point, I stepped away from the supply chain software company and put a managing director in place. And after some time, the business also made a pivot. So by the time the CEO has changed, most of the employees have changed, the business has pivoted. It's probably time to re, to revisit the values. And I don't say we throw them out and start again, but a lot of our work is just that, Andreas, is refreshing the values. And we keep the best of that really is true and exists, and we make them a little bit more memorable and catchy and easy to use in everyday language, and then do the rest of the things that we talked about. So yes, I do believe there are times when it's appropriate to do that. And I don't know, it seems to happen a lot when companies are doing like moving into a new office, or it's sort of inflections in the company's growth, and it can be really energizing to do it. And unlike a lot of people that teach culture, where they say values should be discerned by the leaders and then rolled out to everybody, which I think is crazy. How about involving the whole population in the refresh, and then everybody feels like they contributed, everybody feels bought in, and everybody believes that these really are the values of us. They recognize themselves in those, and that is how you can get a little magic upturn in your company's trajectory.
And how do you kind of help bubble up those values or those ideas that come from like the ecosystem, or you mentioned the
Yeah.
employees, the suppliers, the customers, like the whole circle around the company? How do you help these values bubble up, and like how do these crystallize into just a few values at the very top?
Yes, that's well done, Andres. It's a really, really insightful question. Well, the answer is, and by the way, in my second book, The Culture Fix, sorry, The Gift of Culture, we actually lay out all the survey questions that we ask the different stakeholders, and we talk and that's a fable, Andres. That's a story of a coach helping a CEO transform the culture in their company, and at the same time, the CEO is transformed. It's really cool. But the answer is we survey those different populations, right? Which doesn't take long at all. We also do some interviews of those different, of a smaller number, of course, of those different stakeholders. And then and then we use tools that will show word clouds, right? And it'll show what values across all those different, that ecosystem, are actually bubbling to the top, to use your words there. Excuse me. And then we start building mind maps for the values and for the descriptive behaviors coming off those values. And then we go through a sort of messy, creative, iterative process of boiling those down to something that is a very tight description of the culture. But the end result is partly about that, and of course it wasn't dreamt up. It came by asking, who are we? What makes us who we are? What makes us great? And so it's partly the outcome that comes from a very genuine process and place, but it's also the journey of getting there, of testing these mind maps with folks. Hey, what do you like? What don't you like? What feels like it really is us? What makes us different? What is our, all those kinds of questions. And so that's how we boil it down. That's how we involve everybody, but end up with something that is, unique. I like to think that those values are going to be the only company in the world with those values when we're finished. And sometimes, Andreas, they're phrases, sometimes they rhyme, but there's definitely a look and feel to those
Hmm.
words. And then, of course, very important so that's kind of the alive part of our process. In the thrive part of the process, we then bring imagery, because there's lots of research that shows when we combine words with imagery, we augment our communal intelligence. How beautiful is that? If you're in the culture business, augment our communal intelligence and increase the human bandwidth. Increase human bandwidth to what? Well, to remember, to recall the values, to use them in everyday conversation. And so when we're done, we don't just have amazing words, but they look beautiful too. They're combined with engaging imagery. 65% of us are visual learners. Why not tap into that? And picture tells 1,000 words, right? So
So how do
that's
you
an
do that?
important part of our Thrive process.
Do you have like superheroes or like personas
Sometimes,
or
yes, yes, very often, or I would say sometimes that is the outcome, that we personify the values with superheroes. Now but that depends on the culture. That works for techie cultures, and it works for cultures maybe that are working outdoors, kind of a lot of labor work. We've found, but then sometimes real images, real photographs work, or we actually have artists create you know, images with backdrops, with icons for each value. And there's a number of examples on our website at theculturefix.works. And my next book that's coming out next year, Andreas, is going to be the glorious book of core charts, where we want to inspire the world to create their own core chart based on combining their magical values with an engaging image to help all the good things that come from having a core chart, which does not just have the values on. By the way, we also like to put on there the core purpose, which has a core date and a core target. So that's something else that every 3 years or so I like to see people redo their core chart with a new core purpose.
well, it's inspiring to hear your vision about people and culture and how you're living it, but you're also gifting it. Uh, it's not just that it's your business, but I think you're doing a lot of work to really help um, employees, people, companies out there understand who they are and live those values. Um, one question I have for you before we wrap up. Is there something you read or something or a book or something else which you really appreciated and you think more people should be reading or watching?
There's a lot of great books and a lot of great teachers on this stuff. And Andreas, on the Entrepreneurs Organization, we have thirst for learning is one of our values, and of course, and there's a lot of teachers that have come before me whose teachings I've adopted and used and turned into something practical. So without mentioning any of those, I mean, I think I would go to my father really as being my inspiration, if that's sort of where you're going. My father was, he was a part of making it possible for me to build treehouses. But he was just a real values man, and he had some phrases, some sayings, which I've loved and I love to. Which I think is really where a lot of my inspiration comes from. Things like, do what you do well, boy. That's something he would say. Do what you do well, boy. And today we're trying to get, excuse me. Oh, I've got a frog in my throat. Excuse me, Andres. Today companies are still struggling, aren't they, with accountability. We just want people to do their job and do it well. And so things like that, I think, made me, focus in on that. Another one of his was, a job begun is a job well done. Oh, no, it's a job half done. Sorry. A job begun is a job half done. So anyway, I would look to my father. He never actually wrote a book, but if he had, that would be the one I would turn people on to. But I'm trying to,
So
live his legacy.
you're getting to write these books for him, from the sounds of it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So Will, I really enjoyed the nuggets of gold you shared with us. There were some parts which I'm going to quote, and I think I just want to wish you good luck with really spearheading this vision of companies living their values and helping employees be the best they can, and again living the values.
Yes. Thank you, Andres. We believe we can have a $1 billion impact on the profitability of 10,000 companies and their million employees globally by 2030. Why? So that they are loyal, fulfilled, and have the freedom to be happy at work. And I only need 100 coaches to achieve that. And we're on our way.
You're on your way. Good luck with that, Will. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast, Andreas.